Hi everyone, welcome to my review of John Glen's The Living Daylights from 1987. So yes, here we are once again back to discuss James Bond, the 15th film in this series, and yes, once again, yes, John Glen directing this film. He'd done all the 80s Bonds, of course, and this time we have a new Bond, Timothy Dalton. So yes, he was in two films, obviously, only two films. I think that's very unfortunate, but yes, there's been a kind of a gap. You may have noticed between my re-review of A View to a Kill and this film, I did say I'd have an extra gap to kind of let the Roger Moore, the seven big amount of films, seven Roger Moore films sink in and kind of to kind of take them in as an overall piece, and then not rush in particularly to a new Bond, and yes. It just allowed for a kind of relaxing kind of gap, and then yes, going into this film, in terms of me rewatching these films, it's been around 2 weeks, of a gap, but now here we are back once again to talk about Bond, and yes, a new Bond, and of course this is a very, very interesting film. Of course there will be spoilers in this discussion, so if you haven't seen this film, certainly I recommend it. I recommend all Bonds except a few maybe, in that sense, but yes, I recommend this film. And then once you've seen it, you can come back preferably to this review, and then we can discuss from there. So with that said, as always, yes, here we are. Yes, this is a very, very unique and interesting Bond, and I think it's a real, significant Bond. There's so many things in this film. People leaving the series, or some firsts of the series as well. Or bringing back different elements, of this franchise. So of course, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is John Barry. His departure from this franchise. This is the final film, as we know, that he scored, in this Bond franchise. That is something pivotal. I think, to be quite honest, and this isn't my favourite, John Barry Bond score, this film here, but even this film, it may not be my favourite from him, but it's still better than most for me. Later films in the franchise. There's a few that maybe, yes, to top this, definitely Casino Royale, in terms of the score, but really not much else, in my opinion. I think, John Barry was the greatest, composer for Bond, and it's just so, significant, of course, that he left, after this film. So very sad, but this is a great, great score. I must say that now. And yes, of course, Timothy Dalton, two Bond films, that he was ever in, and I think personally, I'll say it now, that is a very, a great shame. I think even if we had one Bond film, or maybe even two Bond films in between License to Kill and GoldenEye, imagine that, because of course a 6-year gap, it could easily have been enough time for two Bond films at least, put in there, and we could have had 4 Timothy Dalton films. Even 3 would have been great, because he's really such a great actor, Timothy Dalton. Personally for me, I really do love Timothy Dalton as an actor. I think as Bond, I think really, really, great. Timothy Dalton, brought something once again to the franchise. I feel, it's kind of a callback to the classic Bonds. Of course, Sean Connery in particular, and George Lazenby, of course. Because it's definitely very different to the Roger Moore kind of take, on the character, and the actual tone of it as well. It's very, very different. But yes, the atmosphere perhaps of this film, but the performance, the actual, the kind of portrayal of Bond is much more similar to the Connery kind of take than the Roger Moore take as well, and even the Pierce Brosnan kind of take as well. I think very, very interested in this, and I think Timothy Dalton, is great in this film, and I think he's even better, in License to Kill, and of course I won't be talking about the film too much, in this review, but yes, it's very interesting to kind of see, that it's very different, these two films, and both films contain a great Bond performance. I think Timothy Dalton is just so good. He brings this ruthless feeling back. That of course just wasn't really, it wasn't attempted with the Roger Moore films. They weren't about that, and they didn't need to be. It's just a different take, and I think, as much as it is, kind of its own thing, I think I do appreciate, in many regards, putting it that way, I do appreciate the kind of return to the kind of Bond, that I love as well, and that is the ruthless, gritty, kind of Bond, and not cold Bond, but just someone who isn't, maybe as, jokey in a particular way. It's the smoothness, of course. All these Bonds bring a smoothness, and a kind of suave, sophisticated feeling to the character. But this ruthless, hard-hitting, kind of aggression, perhaps you could say, and I really love that about Timothy Dalton and his portrayal of Bond. And in this film, especially the first hour of this film, it's just on point. And I must say, I wasn't a big fan of this film, back, when I reviewed this previously. I kind of thought, it's a film that had great promise, and it was just simply a film that lost itself. And I do, still hold different opinions about this film. That's maybe, it's kind of conflicting. I do think this is definitely an inconsistent film. It's not. I'll say it now. Personally, for me, it's not one of my favourite Bond films. But I think what I will say is this film overall has grown on me, certainly quite a bit. And I think the first. We'll talk about the first kind of 50 minutes or so of this film before they get to the film moves to Tangier, different kind of areas, of course, taking a hold, different plot points escalating, and really a shift in tone. Before that, the first 50 minutes of this film, is absolutely, for me, stunning to behold. I think this is just, based on this first 50 minutes, this could have been, for me, one of the best. I must say that. I think it's definitely would have been floating around the kind of top 10 mark of Bond films, and that is saying something, because that's, the certain films that I've mentioned, I've already reviewed, of course, that are in this or around this top 10 that are just legendary to me, as pieces of cinema. And for that film, for this film here to be on that level is high praise indeed. I think there's a few things that flaws, slight issues, very slight issues that I have with the first 50 minutes, but mostly really stunning stuff. And I think the opening scene, one of the top six, I must say that, one of the top six opening sequences to Bond in the history of the franchise. I think, of course, the pre-title sequence, that is. And yes, this is stunning. It gives me these epic feelings, and just the way the music kicks in, of course. But the reveal of our new Bond, that is one of the most epic revealed in cinema. It really, really is. I think this is just absolutely on point. This is perfect cinematic perfection. That kind of certain moment there. You see that other individual falling off the cliff there, and you see, of course, just Dalton there. Turning around, the zoom in, his hair blowing in the wind there, and it's just epic stuff. And it gives me the chills, and that whole sequence there. From the music kicking, of course, as well. Really amping up this music. Of course, he jumps onto the car on the roof, and this is just a thrilling opening sequence. My slight kind of the slight with this opening sequence is the moment when he lands on the kind of boat there, and the exchange a little bit out of place, and the kind of the Bond James Bond line, that kind of happens here. I don't think it's one of the best. It's not a perfect moment there. I think it's definitely not my favourite. But I think other than that, really, this is just one of the most legendary opening sequences. In cinema, really. Really is just so good. And I think, yes, just seeing this action, the way it's been put together, as I say, the music there, the use of music, John Barry, of course, providing such an epic score, in this film, and I think as well very beautiful. Once again, that's what he brought to the series, and I think, of course, the title sequence. Again, it's nothing too kind of stand out in the way the titles are designed. Perhaps not one of my favourites, but the actual theme is really, really good. I think I'm a big fan of Aha, and yes, of course, this theme, of course, the Living Daylights, really is something else. And I think the way it's kind of incorporated into the score as well, John Barry here, just really, does this so wonderfully. I really love the kind of the way it's integrated, the instrumental kind of version, of course, in this score. I think is great, and just on a whole, the score is one of the best things about this film, consistently remarkable, actually, for me, and really something else. I think certainly left the series on a high note, certainly, and yes, the opening sequence just really is something else, as I say. And yes, seeing, of course, Bond, Timothy Dalton's portrayal in the first act of the film, and going into the kind of the 50-minute mark, just under the hour mark, really, he is just so good. And I think that the kind of it's a real kind of almost perfect blend of kind of plot, elements, character work, and action, thrills, romance even. I think Kara, of course, played by Maryam Diabo, is actually, it's really good. Very intriguing at first. I think, of course, all the stuff going on with the cello, and the way as well they use that in the action sequence, and the kind of the case as well, to kind of in the snow and implants there, just really creative, thrilling, charming. It really is something else. I think even this kind of relationship at first. I love Koskov. He really is such a hilarious character, and I think really throughout the film, really one of the most compelling aspects, about this whole adventure. It really is a globe-trotting film. This, I think, the adventure feeling is definitely always there. But we'll get to different moments, and the way that the film shifts very soon. But yes, Jerome Krob plays, of course, Koskov, a KGB defector, and of course, very many twists, of course, as we know, going on with his character. He eventually becomes one of the the bad guys, perhaps, the villains. But yes, I think I really loved this character, especially in the first hour of the film, and I think it's just really great. The way he always seems to be overwhelmed by seeing Bond. The sight of Bond, really gets him, excited. He's all kind of jolly, and this is very funny. But yeah, great character, and the way the film marriages plot and character work, as I say, just the atmosphere of this is something that's really just it feels like a classic Bond. In these from Russia with Love, I feel it's very close to that kind of feeling there. Just this kind of darkness to it, but the jokiness as well. From Russia with Love, of course, all these Bond films, they have the humour, they have the kind of the wit about them, but they're very controlled. These films that I mentioned, very much really atmospheric, and definitely character driven. Something you can really get behind, in a serious way, but of course not a film that takes itself too seriously. And of course, I was so impressed once again, even more so by this first 50 minutes. I just think all these side characters, seeing Q, Q Branch, the scenes there, some of the very best, in the series. I love the kind of the sofa there as well, and the way that, it's brilliant stuff. And of course, just all these different gadgets, and these moments, seeing all these, different individuals all together. I love this. I love seeing M in the film as well, and just all these different moments early on. Seeing the usual characters, and of course new faces as well. Just the combination here. It felt so warm. It felt so many different characters, but didn't overtake the focus on Bond, of course, and of course this other character Kara, who's very intriguing at first. Now I've praised this kind of stunning opening 50 minutes, which is a very big portion of any film. 50 minutes consistently. This film for this 50 minutes or so is just stunning. It really is. Very few flaws here, and unfortunately, this film really goes in a very different direction. I just kind of I have to admit, I just don't. This is definitely it's a real peak Bond at times. It's just really great to see, and it trumps as I say, this opening, almost an hour of the film trumps many of the, the kind of the Bond films, since On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This film here, at the same time, as this first 50 minutes is just, really stunning, I think it does take a, downturn. It never recovers for me personally, to this standard. Many things in the film completely change. I really can't fathom this. It's something that I am quite, confused at actually. Still confused. As a roughly almost a week ago, I actually watched this film again. At the time doing this review. But yes, it's still kind of in my mind about how, for me personally, I just lost the investment by a big margin. I think the film just changed completely. The transitions to the different locations, and just the tone and the romance as well, and all the different side characters that are kind of introduced, in these. In the second half of the film, it doesn't grab me, and unfortunately, it just never recovered really to the standards of this first almost an hour. But the nail in the coffin for me is the kind of the funfair sequence. It's the big turning point for me. I think Cara was really good, really good. When she was. The scenes, of course, when Bond is directing her, to kind of, hide and was trying to get away there, and of course, in the car and everything there, and just great stuff. Kind of a romance comedy mix here that was very compelling, very enjoyable, and she was, a really interesting character with some really good writing. But really, once they kind of go full on with this romance on this particular occasion, as much as I always, everyone who knows my channel will know I love romance in cinema, so much. It's one of my favourite, things about films, and I just love, many Bond romances, but for some reason this one just really, it just feels very awkward. There's many different moments, even, this funfair sequence where it just does not work for me. Unfortunately, it's very cringy, and I didn't expect that, from a Bond film, and I forgot about this, and then I remembered, there's this kind of the romance in this film. I've never been a big fan of, and I think, it just doesn't work for me. It's very awkward, as I say, very cringy, and it just doesn't work. I think it's very. It kind of takes me out of the film, and just too much with what they're doing, and it just doesn't feel authentic. It's not something I get behind at all, unfortunately, even though it was so well set up, and the way she has a really well written arc at first, and the initial introduction to her character Cara, the sniping element there, just the whole kind of opening act, the way she's involved in the film was really great, but it just went awry, and never really recovered, and I never really enjoyed the romance for the rest of the film, and it was just very, as I say, quite cringy, unfortunately. I never say that about Bond, because this really is the only Bond romance that I feel where it is focused on in this way. I think is the only one that is actually awkward, to this level. So yeah, very disappointing, unfortunately. But Dalton is great throughout the whole film, and I love the kind of the way in which he dispatches of the enemies in the film. I love the kind of throughout the entire film his portrayal of Bond. There's a few moments that kind of and that's just due to other characters, it doesn't work as well. But Dalton here, and in License to Kill, he gives great performances. He was a great Bond for me, and he has this real unique, just kind of likability. Actually, kind of I compare this to maybe George Lazenby in the way that he didn't do too many films, and he wasn't maybe like Bond for some people, perhaps, and how they want Bond, but particular likability, of these two actually, in particular, that just kind of stands out, and the kind of the comparisons, of course, the same kind of amount of films as well. Not in too many films, but made an impression. Even just on the likability and the kind of the presence alone. And I think other than that, of course, the physicality of Timothy Dalton, you know, is really something else. I think really, it feels like a great return to very, you know, physical, you know, felt, visceral, you know, action scenes in Bond, and that's what I love about the film as well. I love the plane. The plane sequence, you know, that's one of the you know, the kind of standout moments, of course, in the second half. You know, I think this is just absolutely stunning. It's an epic, you know, just mind-blowing sequence. I feel, you know, the work here that was put into this, and just the way in which it kind of enthralls me. It really is unbelievable stuff, and just really something that I get so pumped up with. You know, it's a shame that the film, you know, has a very, for me, unnecessary last 10 minutes after that kind of sequence. Of course, Jeroen Baker, all the stuff going on there, you know, just it's too much. It really takes away again, and it's just kind of the tone of that is very different. You know, it just feels very out of place, and really for me, didn't need to be in the film. But you know, other than that, I think the final act generally does pick up once again, and you know, has some really thrilling moments, you know, of action. And I think as the film goes on, you know, another thing about this is the kind of the way in which you know, the side characters, you know, are introduced, and the different, you know, the additions, all these different characters, many characters in this film, of course. In the second half, though, this is when I just don't find a number of these characters too interesting. For example, Kamran, you know, who's on paper, you know, this is a really interesting character. The backstory that's given, you know, the exposition throughout this film, you know, on paper is very compelling. But for whatever reason, you know, just doesn't really invest me. You know, these characters. There's very few characters that I'm truly compelled by in the kind of second half, and I think even you know, Jeroen Baker, who's also in Goldeneye, you know, is a completely different character. You know, in this film, you know, I didn't really care too much for the kind of the way that kind of went about, particularly the last, as we know, the last sort of kind of scenes here. In the last 10 minutes, you've got that. You know, it seems like to me kind of a deleted scene that's just been chucked in here. It's very unnecessary, I feel. But yeah, you know, the characters in the first half of the film, you know, for example, Saunders, that's the one that really comes to mind, played by Thomas Wheatley. You know, he is great in this film. I think the charm and the kind of the interactions with Bond here, you know, that's what really, another thing that really makes this first, you know, half of the film. And I think, you know, really grounded character work. You know, side characters who feel alive. They feel authentic, and they don't feel too silly. You know, and the characters in the second half of the film, the treatment of this and the tone of the film completely shifts to much more of a campy Bond film once again. I think, you know, I love my campy Bond films. I love my serious ones. You know, when these areas are done well, you know, just like any film, you know, that's the way it is. And I think on this occasion, the thing is, it doesn't really fit with the rest of the film, and it's kind of this film feels like you know, a meshing, you know, of different styles and tones and different, you know, aspects that don't quite you know, perfectly mesh. You know, they don't quite fit, you know, in different ways. And I think the campy, silly, over the top tone of the second half just kind of takes away, you know, and you know, doesn't allow this kind of this was something really different, you know, something, and a callback. I feel to the kind of Connery Bonds, you know, in its tone and its kind of atmosphere. And I think the atmosphere, that's the thing, it's really lost. It feels like a real, you know, spy film. It feels like a real kind of on edge experience. Very Hitchcockian once again. Details, you know, different moments, different elements, different items perhaps that kind of you know, revealed to us, or character reveals. You know, just this tension, this atmosphere that I don't personally see this. I cannot see this in this way in the second half, and that's a shame. But you know, having said that, you know, I don't think any of the second half is, you know, ever gets to a point where I don't, you know, overall enjoy the film. It's simply just you know, average kind of sequences mostly, with some great flourishes, you know, of action perhaps, or kind of you know, Bond moments, but never really regaining that kind of authentic, charming, atmospheric, you know, first 50 minutes that was very nearly, you know, flawless really for me. I think it would have been one of the best Bonds if it carried on going to this kind of level, and who knows, it could have, if the film had got even better at this point, than that 50-minute mark, and had the film really followed through with the romance, and kind of kept it, kind of grounded and not too kind of on the nose perhaps, then it would have possibly been one of my top 10 Bond films, and I think certainly much so. And I think it's a shame that the film goes in different directions. That's just my personal opinion of this film. I think it's got too much bland moments that just kind of feel flat as the film goes on. I think some of the middle of the film shows some real promise with different introductions with different characters, but unfortunately, by the end of the film, different kind of characters that are introduced in this film just don't really feel that interesting, and it doesn't feel like I've really gotten behind different moments. So it's a shame. This film, once again, it's a remarkable and underwhelming film. At the same time, I think this film has some legendary moments. The opening sequence is one of the most thrilling opening sequences I've seen in a long, long time. I think it's one of the best kind of Bond opening sequences. I think it's one of the kind of top 6 or so opening sequences, and I really love Timothy Dalton in this film. The romance doesn't work, unfortunately, even though he really gives it his all in that sense. I think the romance just doesn't work for me. The dynamics, it is a bit cringy. Unfortunately, it just doesn't invest me as the film goes on. The funfair sequence, I just don't get behind, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to kind of be really just loving this kind of chemistry. It just doesn't work for me, unfortunately. But I think it's definitely commendable with trying to kind of bring this kind of this character of Cara into a more of a central role, because she's so interesting at first, and of course they do make her a character who's really with Bond throughout a lot of the film, but unfortunately they just the way it's executed, different moments with this kind of full-on romance on this occasion, it just doesn't really work at all for me, and it's very, very just awkward, unfortunately. But yes, I think there's some real stunning moments in the second half that do allow the film to kind of regain some sort of kind of thrilling kind of elements. And I think the plane sequence, for example, is one of the the best sequences in the film, action wise. But I think it just doesn't really this film, I'm not invested anywhere near as much. So as the film goes on, but I think overall it's a good Bond film. I would have been calling this an absolute great Bond film. With such mastery of different elements, and I think the score to this film. Let's focus on the positives. Wrapping up this review, I think the score, is a legendary score. I love the kind of the way it's used in the action. Especially the plane sequence, the opening sequence as well, and I love the kind of operatic nature of this film. That's something that was missing as the film went on. It's the use of classical music. For example, in the kind of the opera sequences there. Of course, the whole kind of the way in which the characteristics, of course, of Cara. The fact that she plays the cello, and just this whole kind of sophisticated feeling and treatment, and the way the classical music is actually used in the film really adds this feeling. That I don't think the film, it definitely lacked as the film went on, and for me it just kind of became, turned into a very, at times quite bland, bloated action adventure film, unfortunately, with some, forgettable characters, and just things that didn't work too well. But as I say, I do respond positively overall to this film. I think it's a very enjoyable film overall, because the first hour really mostly was just so good. I think it's just a stunning, two halves this film really, but with some great moments in the second half. But overall, the first half is just absolute, legendary status Bond, and I think Timothy Dalton I'm a big fan of in this film. But I think there's certain moments, of course, yeah, they don't work too well, in the second half, but really, Timothy Dalton, I think, really gives a great performance, and yes, just the atmosphere to this. I think the highs of this film, allow me to take this, in real consistent highs, regardless of my thoughts on the second half, my personal feelings. I think the heights of this film, are some of the real legendary kind of Bond moments, and I think just this, I take this film, based on that alone, over many different Bond films. I think this is definitely not overall one of the best Bonds, but I think it's not one of the worst either. It's a divisive film. I'm on the positive side, absolutely. I do love, of course, the first, almost the first hour of the film. I absolutely adore that, and I think there are definitely moments in the second half that I do love as well. For example, the plane sequence is just, it's so thrilling. The way it's put together, the tension levels, the use of music. It's legendary moments like this that just allow me to to kind of maybe kind of not forgive, but kind of look past my kind of flaws with the film. And at times it's slight flaws, other times it's more crucial flaws, just for my enjoyment of the film. But I think this film is great in its first hour, really, and I think the second hour not so much. But yes, overall, it kind of balances out to a good Bond film. It's definitely one that I think has more potential than the kind of what the film kind of plays out to be in that sense. But I think overall, definitely a good film and a very enjoyable Bond film. I think it's kind of around the area of different Bonds that I kind of defend as well. Octopussy, these kinds of films. I think it's one of them that I do really enjoy, and I think not great Bond films overall, but ones that I do really enjoy, and good, solid, impressive overall Bond films. And The Living Daylights, it's a very unique film that I do really appreciate, and I do kind of cherish as well for different kind of elements, and of course John Barry, his final score, of course, and yes, some of the best Q moments as well of the series. And I think Timothy Dalton, one of his only Bond films, of course, only being in 2 Bond films, I cherish this film for that, and of course the beauty of it, the way the film's shot, even as the film goes on, it's all shot wonderfully, really, really lovely stuff, and a warm film. That's one of the things. It's a warm film, that feels very, very pleasant throughout, and it's definitely moments that don't interest me as much, anywhere near as much as the film goes on, but it's always pleasant to kind of be a part of, and to kind of sit back and just enjoy the kind of adventure feel, and the maybe flat at times sequences, but nevertheless pleasant experiences, and ones that I do enjoy overall. So despite the shortcomings of the film, in my opinion, I do overall think it's a good, solid Bond, and overall a very enjoyable film in the franchise. So yes, my final rating for this film this time round is a very, very solid score of 72%. The same score that I gave Octopussy this time round. So of course that's a film that I really enjoy overall, and not a film like Octopussy that I think is a great Bond, legendary Bond, but really definitely all these ones, and all the ones after these, these kinds of ratings, I do consider them worthy Bond films, particularly. So yes, I do really appreciate this film, and just the things to cherish. Timothy Dalton, for example, of course, and Saunders as well. The character of Saunders, and just different moments in this film, and of course the first almost the first hour I absolutely love. The second hour and a bit I'm not too big on, but that's fine. Sometimes that happens, many times that happens in different films, or maybe the third act of the film, or the first act. As we know, sometimes in comparison, isn't kind of something you can get behind as much, for whatever reason. Of course, hopefully I have explained roughly my kind of thoughts on this, and the reasons for not or preferring different segments of the film, two different halves of the film. I think it's a very kind of divisive film. I think it's a very inconsistent film, unfortunately, but that's fine. It's a film that I do love different elements of, even in the second half. But overall, it's the first half of this film that I really love, and I think the opening sequence is just seriously a stunning sequence. It really is. Thrilling, kind of wowing moment. In Bond. In the franchise, and I think Timothy Dalton, is a great Bond. He really is someone that I get behind. As kind of portraying Bond. I think he's really so well written in this film. I love the atmosphere. I love the kind of the grounded character work, the sophistication, the ruthless feeling of the first 50 minutes, and I love the kind of even the incorporation of different elements, the romance in the film. It does go on to become something I'm not as invested in, but based on the first 50 minutes, I really I love most elements about this film, as I say. So it's very it's a kind of a I'm kind of torn on this film, overall, but I do, regardless of kind of where it goes, ends up, maybe in its tone and the investing feeling for me personally, just my brain, of course now I'm connecting into the film, it is of course, very much 50-50 almost, film in terms of my reaction to it, but never is a point where it kind of becomes a bad a bad Bond film, by no means, by no standards is this a bad Bond film. It just has some things that I don't I think maybe are average or mediocre, and definitely some elements that I'm not as big on, but that's why I've given it a kind of a solid score, because I love and then not so much, definitely, so it kind of balances out to a good solid Bond outing, with some real mastery, and greatness, in there for enough time to really overall get behind this experience. So yes, hopefully, this is something that I've maybe explained some regard to why, what I think about this film and why it's not one of my absolute favourites, even though the first 50 minutes or so is one of my favourites. So yes, The Living Daylights, a very impressive Bond film, and a very enjoyable Bond, one that really has some real peaks. Some real heights. As a Bond film, and yes, of course, I look forward to rewatching. Of course, License to Kill. Of course, these two films they have a kind of a split fan base at times, but let's all be Bond fans. But I expect everyone will be respectful. Let's all be respectful Bond fans, and of course share our opinions in the comments, and just have a great time. Hopefully talking about Bond, of course, and it's just discussing Timothy Dalton, perhaps his in my opinion great kind of portrayal of Bond in both of these films, and I think yes, just let's kind of discuss Bond as we do, and in an enjoyable and kind of respectful manner. That's what we look forward to, and yes, of course, I look forward to massively to watching again License to Kill. I really have some, well, yes, extremely positive, of course, opinions of that film. I do prefer that film to The Living Daylights, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a separate review. But yes, I think Timothy Dalton, to me, is a legend, and of course, this film is very unique as a Bond film. It has different blends of genres, and tones and styles. I feel, and it's of course a return, a callback, and of course as well seeing another Bond, different feeling perhaps, but it really feels like a Bond film at times. It really does, and yes, it's definitely a good film, a solid film. By all means, it's not a bad film, and I think it's definitely a positive reaction that I'm giving this film. So yes, tell me your thoughts. What do you think of this? And of course, I can understand it's not a film that everyone loves, but or likes perhaps, as a Bond film, but I do like it, and it'd be great to know what you think, regardless, and it'd be great to kind of discuss Bond as a whole once again, and yes, I look forward to these discussions, and yes, I look forward to continuing, of course, my journey once again on this entire series. So yes, as always, take care, and yes, thanks for watching.